Native Americans didn't fight like anyone else. They didn't have castles, catapults, or matching uniforms. They didn't march in neat little lines or wait for someone to blow a trumpet before unleashing hell. What they had instead was pure tactical genius, shaped by centuries of surviving in some of the harshest environments on the continent. From the burning deserts of Arizona to the frozen ridges of Montana, Native American tribes developed battle tactics so clever, so bizarre, and so effective that entire military campaigns collapsed under the weight of them. They used buffalo herds as battering rams. They made soldiers vanish into tall grass and used fire as a weapon. Some even faked their own deaths mid-battle, only to stab you in the back when you got too close. Today, we're diving into the absolute craziest, smartest, and most unexpected battle tactics used by Native American warriors. Not the Hollywood nonsense with feathers and noble speeches. We're talking real strategies, real blood, real ingenuity. So grab your bow, smear some mud on your face, and prepare to be ambushed. The Apache, stealth, disguise, and weaponized shadows. Long before special forces crawled through jungle swamps, the Apache were already perfecting the art of silent movement. These guys didn't just sneak up on enemies, they ghosted them, and then vanished again. Apache warriors trained to move without a sound, using heel-to-toe walking, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in deerskin moccasins that let them blend into the dust. They traveled in small groups and used mountain ridges to conceal their approach. Their goal wasn't just to attack, it was to make you think you were being hunted by spirits. Then they'd hit hard, fast, and disappear like smoke in the wind. They also used sunlight and shadows to mask movement. During daylight ambushes, Apaches timed their attacks with the shifting sun to make sure the enemy was blinded just long enough to lose their bearings. And if you thought you could track them, think again. Apaches would walk backwards in soft earth or brush their tracks with yucca branches to cover their retreat. Some even wore hoof-shaped sandals to make it look like a deer or horse passed through. Yes, they weaponized footprints. American soldiers feared Apache ambushes more than any straight-up battle. General Crook once called them the most dangerous wild enemies on the continent, because by the time you figured out where the Apaches were, you were already bleeding. The Comanche, horseback assassins of the southern plains. The Comanche were the stuff of cavalry nightmares. Fast, agile, unpredictable, they took the horse and turned it into a weapon. By the mid-1800s, no tribe had done more to redefine mounted combat in North America. Let's be clear, the Comanche didn't just ride, they became the horse. Boys learned to ride before they could walk. Warriors could pick up fallen arrows at a full gallop. Some could leap between two moving horses while shooting from both hands. And they didn't just fight on horseback. They hid behind the horse's body while galloping, dangling off the side with only one foot hooked on the saddle. Their favorite move? The feigned retreat. Here's how it worked. Charge the enemy, make a lot of noise, maybe fire a few arrows, then suddenly turn and bolt. The other side thinks, "We scared them off," and gives chase. But the Comanche weren't running. They were pulling you out of cover. And once you were exposed in the open plains, they circled back, cut you off, and wiped you out from all sides. They also had a terrifying arrow tactic, saturation fire. While moving at full speed, they would unleash wave after wave of arrows into a formation, never stopping to reload. Quivers were often filled with 50 or more arrows. The goal wasn't precision, it was chaos. Horses would panic, soldiers would scatter, and within minutes, what had been an organized column became a bloodbath. The US military learned fast. Don't fight the Comanche on the open plains, because by the time you lifted your rifle, they were already behind you. The Lakota, stampedes, decoys, and the power of the prairie. The Lakota, part of the larger Sioux nation, didn't just know the land, they were part of it. They used the vast, flat grasslands of the northern plains like one giant battlefield board. Every hill, every coulee, every herd of buffalo was a potential weapon. One of their most insane tactics? buffalo stampede ambushes. When cavalry patrols approached, Lakota scouts would locate a nearby herd and send in riders to drive it. Not away from the soldiers, but through them. A few thousand pounds of thundering bison didn't just break the line. It sent horses fleeing, wagons crashing, and soldiers diving for cover. The chaos gave Lakota warriors time to attack from the flanks, or slip away completely. But the real magic was in their decoy tactics. A small group of Lakota fighters would appear in the distance, taunting the enemy, waving weapons, shouting, sometimes mooning them just for fun. The soldiers would chase. The Lakota would fall back, always just out of reach. They'd lead the pursuers across a few ridges, maybe a creek or two, until suddenly the ground exploded with warriors lying in wait. One battle in 1866, known as the Fetterman Fight, was a textbook version. Captain William Fetterman chased a decoy party of just 10 Lakota riders, straight into a trap of over 1,000. His entire force was wiped out in under an hour. Not one soldier survived. Let that sink in. A group of 10 warriors baited a U.S. Army unit into walking off a cliff, and they never saw it coming. The Cheyenne. Fire as a weapon and trickery as policy. The Cheyenne were thinkers, strategists. They didn't just fight for land, they fought for balance, meaning, and long-term survival. But when it came to war, they knew how to play dirty in the smartest possible ways. One of their wildest tools? Fire. Cheyenne warriors knew how to manipulate the dry prairie winds. During battles, especially at night, they would ignite grasslands upwind from enemy camps. The smoke blinded patrols. The flames forced troops into the open. Sometimes the fire was a weapon. Sometimes it was just a giant distraction to hide a retreat or ambush. In one engagement near the Platte River, Cheyenne and Arapaho fighters set fire to a valley while attacking from the ridges. Soldiers couldn't see more than a few feet, and the sound of hoofbeats and war cries echoed off the canyon walls. It was sensory warfare. No clear target, just fear. The Cheyenne also perfected council tactics. They planned battles through a collective leadership of military societies, each with specialized roles. Dog soldiers for skirmishing, bowstring men for defense, etc. This decentralized approach made them unpredictable. There was no single general to outmaneuver. And if they needed to disappear, they didn't just run. They would scatter in all directions, separate into family bands, and vanish into the river valleys of Colorado and Wyoming like smoke from their own campfires. The Navajo. Canyon warfare and the art of disappearing. If you ever wanted to know what it feels like to get lost, humiliated, and shot at, all at the same time, try invading Navajo territory. The Navajo homelands weren't flat plains or open deserts. They were a labyrinth of sandstone canyons, hidden caves, and sheer cliffs in what is now Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Places like Canyon de Chelly weren't just natural wonders. They were military bunkers carved by wind, water, and time, and the Navajo knew every inch. When U.S. soldiers tried to flush them out, Navajo warriors would disappear into the high cliffs. They built lookout posts where they could spot movement from miles away. They moved through hidden passes and cliff trails that didn't show up on any map. And when the army finally caught up, they weren't there anymore, or worse, they were above you. Navajo tactics included rolling boulders onto troops below, ambushing supply wagons in narrow ravines, and using natural echo chambers to confuse sound and direction. They could vanish in broad daylight. And when they reappeared, someone usually ended up with an arrow in the leg. They also used psychological warfare. Navajo raids on settler homes were fast, surgical, and frighteningly silent. Livestock would disappear. Tools would go missing. Sometimes they'd leave symbols or markings behind, not to harm, but to remind you they had been there, and that they could come back whenever they wanted. The U.S. Army eventually tried to break them through scorched earth campaigns. But for decades, the Navajo outmaneuvered them with nothing more than the land, patience, and absolute knowledge of every rock and ridge. The Nez Perce, tactical retreats, and the longest game of keep-away in U.S. history. If you think running is cowardice, the Nez Perce would like a word. In 1877, they pulled off one of the most brilliant tactical retreats ever seen on American soil, and humiliated the U.S. Army in the process. Led by Chief Joseph, the Nez Perce weren't trying to win a war. They were trying to escape one. After being pushed off their land in the Wallowa Valley of Oregon, they began a desperate flight toward Canada, hoping to avoid forced relocation. What followed was a 1,170-mile retreat through the Rocky Mountains, pursued by nearly 2,000 U.S. soldiers. Now, here's the kicker. The Nez Perce were outnumbered, outgunned, and had families with them, elders, women, children, and yet they won almost every battle along the way. They used terrain tactics, setting up rear guard ambushes in mountain passes. They crossed rivers at night to confuse their pursuers. They used burned bridges, decoy camps, and fake trail signs to mislead scouts. One detachment of soldiers reportedly spent 3 days circling the same valley, completely unaware they were chasing campfires lit on purpose as bait. Chief Joseph's surrender speech is famous. What's less known is that he only surrendered after being 30 miles from the Canadian border, with his people freezing, starving, and exhausted. And even then, his command structure and tactics had earned the grudging respect of generals like William Tecumseh Sherman. They didn't just run, they orchestrated the most effective mobile resistance in the history of the frontier. The Crow, masters of espionage and betrayal for hire. The Crow Nation had a very different approach to warfare. Why fight directly when you can outsmart everyone instead? Geographically wedged between the Lakota to the east and the Blackfeet to the west, the Crow were often surrounded, and they knew it. So instead of trying to fight every enemy alone, they used alliances and espionage to survive. Their most infamous tactic? Fighting with the U.S. Army. Yep. The Crow became scouts and allies for U.S. military campaigns against other native tribes, especially their arch-enemies, the Lakota and Cheyenne. But this wasn't about loyalty, it was strategy. By aligning with the bigger threat, they eliminated their local enemies and protected their lands from both directions. Crow Scouts were essential to General Custer during the campaign that led to the Battle of Little Bighorn. Ironically, they warned him not to attack. He didn't listen. We all know how that ended. Crow warriors were also expert trackers and code breakers. They'd infiltrate enemy camps, disguised as traders, collect information, then vanish. They would scatter false intel, exaggerate troop sizes, or direct supply lines into dead ends. They were the Wild West's equivalent of MI6, quiet, clever, and always 3 steps ahead. The Blackfeet, winter warfare and the fine art of cruel efficiency. Most armies don't fight in winter. The Blackfeet considered that a good thing, because they did. Living in what's now Montana and Alberta, the Blackfeet adapted to freezing temperatures, snowdrifts, and frozen plains. Their enemies? Not so much. That's where things got ugly. Blackfeet warriors launched winter raids, catching rival tribes and isolated outposts completely off guard. While others were huddled by fires, the Blackfeet were moving across ice sheets at night, using frozen rivers as highways. They often attacked supply caches, food stores, and horse corrals not to start a war, but to let winter do the killing. Cut off someone's food and heat in January, and you didn't need to fire a second arrow. Their tactics also included wolf trail mimicry. Warriors would imitate the travel patterns of wolves, walking single file, circling herds from the leeward side, so enemies assumed it was just predators nearby. Until it wasn't. The Blackfeet weren't flashy, they weren't loud, but they were among the most feared winter fighters in the entire West, and they made survival itself a tactical weapon. The Ute, high-altitude ambush artists. Up in the Rockies, the Ute weren't just fighting battles, they were rewriting the rules of elevation. They lived in the high-altitude basins of Colorado and Utah, where most cavalry units could barely breathe, let alone maneuver. And they loved it that way. The Ute specialized in downhill ambushes, hiding on ridges and cliffs, letting the enemy march through narrow valleys below, then raining down arrows, bullets, or even rocks from above. One favorite trick was the dead-end trail trap. Ute scouts would leave signs of a shortcut up the mountains, often visible from afar. Troops would follow it, thinking they'd found an easier route. Instead, it ended in a rocky bowl, surrounded on three sides, with the Ute waiting at the top. They also moved camp with the seasons, always uphill in summer and lower in winter. Anyone chasing them had to deal with snow, altitude sickness, and a rapidly disappearing trail. And if you tried to chase them up those cliffs, good luck. Ute warriors could scale canyon walls barefoot in minutes, something few army mules or leather-booted soldiers could manage without crying. The scalp as a weapon of fear. Let's talk about one of the most misunderstood and most terrifying tactics on the frontier: scalping. No, it wasn't a Hollywood invention. And no, it wasn't something every native warrior did. But when it happened, it meant something. Because on the battlefield of the Wild West, a single scalp could speak louder than 100 bullets. For many Plains tribes, especially the Comanche, Cheyenne, Lakota, Apache, and Crow, scalping wasn't about cruelty. It was about power. A scalp was proof. Proof that you'd faced death, survived, and taken something from your enemy that they could never get back. It was a trophy, a warning, and a message all in one. Some warriors took scalps during raids not to glorify violence, but to send a message to those who found the bodies. We were here. We won. We could be back tomorrow. It was psychological warfare at its rawest. A settler family coming across a scalped victim didn't just see a dead body. They saw a symbol that the frontier was still wild, and they were not in control. The scalp could also serve as battlefield currency. In some tribes, bringing back a scalp earned you status, access to warrior societies, or the right to wear certain feathers. It wasn't about gore. It was about reputation. In a world without medals, this was the ultimate badge of honor. Now, here's the twist that gets left out of most history books. White settlers, colonial governments, and even U.S. states paid bounties for native scalps. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. In the mid-1700s and again in the 1800s, frontier militias scalped native bodies and cashed them in like receipts. So yes, some native warriors scalped enemies. But it wasn't madness. It was strategy. It was ritual. It was a way to survive a war they never asked for, on land they were trying to defend. When tribes teamed up, coordinated chaos. Throughout the 1800s, native coalitions formed in response to increasing U.S. expansion. And while tribes often had long-standing rivalries, nothing united them faster than a common threat, especially when it rode in wagons and carried flags. One of the deadliest examples? The Northern Plains Alliance that led to the Battle of Little Bighorn. Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors coordinated their camps, patrols, and even signal fires to communicate across miles of terrain. They shared scouts, rotated ambush positions, and funneled the U.S. Army into terrain they had prepared for weeks. It wasn't chaos. It was coordination disguised as chaos, and it worked spectacularly. Another example was the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Technically outside the Wild West time frame, but still relevant in terms of tactical legacy. It showed that communication, timing, and shared purpose could make even scattered groups into a military force capable of dismantling European colonizers. Temporarily, but effectively. These weren't savage uprisings. These were logistical operations carried out across vast distances, often without written language or centralized command. It was all done through runners, oral strategy, and trust. And that, more than any weapon, was what made native resistance so impossible to predict, and so impossible to forget. So now you know. The real tactical masterminds of the Wild West weren't wearing badges or brass buttons. They were out on the ridges, in the ravines, camouflaged in sagebrush or rolling through the dust on horseback. They fought smarter, not louder. They didn't always win, but they almost always left a mark. Their tactics weren't just about survival. They were statements of identity, resilience, and defiance against impossible odds. And the next time someone tells you native warriors were primitive, just remind them that it took the most powerful army on the continent decades to subdue fighters armed with nothing but strategy, a horse, and the land beneath their feet. Because in the Wild West, being outgunned didn't matter if you were never even seen.